You mentioned Os Guinness. He has a very valuable illustration that I think is worth bringing up here. He talks about the public square. Now, once that was, the forum where the Senate met, then it became the Westminster, the Parliament in England. Then newspapers expanded it, and then radio, and then television. And now we have a rudimentary public square that is global because of social media.
Yes.
At the same time as our differences are greater than ever. So the question is, how will we live peacefully with our deepest differences? And that's at heart here. It's coming out in the apparent very, very deep divisions.
Yes.
How do we get over it? Because that limits human flourishing. Hate and discord are terrible things.
Absolutely.
But he paints a very interesting picture. He says we've got three choices when it comes to the public square. We can have a naked one where all religion's forced out and all belief is forced out. You can have one that is religious, where one religion is allowed, even enforced, or you can have an open public square where, subject to certain laws, everyone is free and enjoys the privilege to explore the great issues of life.
Yes.
I think that's quite useful to think of it. A restricted, totalitarian, state-enforced religion, a naked public square, which sounds pretty sterile, or one where we can genuinely communicate and we're free to explore the big issues.
Absolutely, and that was my fourth point about tolerance. That if we're going to have a pluralistic democracy which accommodates human flourishing of as many different groups and beliefs as possible, and yes, there'll be conflicts, so we will need some shared understanding of what is and is not acceptable expressions of those beliefs, understood, but within and subject to those shared agreements on limits on behaviour. People should be free to believe their most fundamental commitments and act on them, and everybody else needs to give them the permission to do it. It was in that sense that I was talking about a true tolerance from every member of society to every other member of society. I wasn't using tolerance in the historical sense of the Tolerance Acts, where the Anglican majority says, "Oh, we'll let the Catholics in for this purpose or that purpose," or the other way around. Yeah. I was talking about the Os Guinness form of tolerance. So we must have a pluralist public square, but the precondition of a truly pluralist public square where we don't all just fight each other to the death is that sense of, I'm going to let you say and do things which I believe are wrong from my worldview, and the quid pro quo is you let me do things and say things which you believe are wrong from your world point of view. That seems to me to be the only way we can reach what Os Guinness is saying about a pluralist democracy where everyone is enabled to flourish.
Yeah. So let's then come to this idea that some people, many public squares, if you like, down through the ages have been marked out by really tough, you will believe this is the official religion and you believe it and there's no room for anything else. Christianity is often, with your historical background, I'd be interested in your views, accused of being intolerant and dictatorial, certainly offensive.
Right.
But I think you would suggest that, in fact, Christians themselves have often argued for liberty and space for dissenters, people who disagree, to have that right.
Yes. So the origins, which we'll come back to in a minute, look, the origins of the idea that conscience lies at the heart of every human being and that it's exercise or worship in accordance with the conscience, to kind of paraphrase Tertullian, in the 3rd century ought to be protected. That's a very distinctive Judeo-Christian idea. But I think just to pick up on the first thing you said first, before I kind of revisit that history, the first thing you said about the kind of the history of intolerance, I think there are a couple of important things to note about that. The first is, I think it's really important to kind of recognize that, yes, that when there are histories and episodes of intolerance within Christianity, it is a healthy thing, and actually a thing in accordance with the very doctrines of Christianity and the teachings of Christianity, that the church needs to recognize that and recognize that has happened. The other interesting thing, though, the other interesting point to make here is that historically, the idea of a kind of pluralistic democracy that we were just talking about, where people from different belief systems can live together, that idea of liberal democracy has a very long history. But it's anachronistic to kind of read back the possibility of religious kind of pluralism into, say, into the pre-modern world anywhere. because simply the idea of the way that states or governments ran themselves in the pre-modern world, the Christian West and elsewhere, relies upon the idea that civil peace and civil harmony is actually maintained through religious unity. It's just not, it's a very modern and anachronistic way to kind of think that there can be religious pluralism in the pre-modern world. It's not how people even thought. It's a much later kind of development. But it is also the case that the idea of liberty for different religious belief systems has its origins in the Judeo-Christian tradition. I mentioned earlier, so Tertullian in the 3rd century AD gives probably one of the most important and earliest articulations of the idea that, and he's arguing that this right that every man ought to worship in accordance with his own conscience, this is an argument he makes for all people, regardless of their own religious beliefs. And so he's actually making that as a kind of universal claim. But the reason there are kind of a couple of reasons for that. The reason is, in part, that Christianity, for the first 3 and something centuries of its existence, it has no relationship, unlike any other, couple of things that are completely distinct about Christianity as a religion. But Christianity, unlike any other ancient religion, has no relationship with political power at its inception.
None.
No relation. No, it's the Christians are persecuted. So it's in the context of Christians being persecuted in the early Roman Empire that Tertullian is making this argument. And what that means is that Christians, for a variety of reasons, but this is one of them, Christians, well, people choose to join the faith and become a Christian on the basis of their conscience. It's about persuasion. It's not about relationship with political power, because there is none. And so Christians make that decision based upon conscience. And it's a very ancient argument. It's an argument even older than Tertullian. Even in the pages of the New Testament, there's actually a distinctly Judeo-Christian idea of the concept of conscience. Now, conscience is talked about in ancient Greek and Roman philosophy, but what is actually distinct about the idea of conscience that is found in the pages of the Bible, Old and New Testament, it's developed more fully really in Paul's letters in the New Testament, is that conscience lies at the heart of what it is to be human, that all human beings, regardless of who they are, where they come from, male or female, Greek or slave or free, Jew or Greek, that every person is endowed with a conscience, and people will, it depends what people do with that conscience. But it's because conscience is understood to lie at the heart of what it is to be human, to make decisions about and to seek the truth based upon conscience, or be convicted, as far as a Christian would understand and believe, convicted of sin on the basis of conscience. It's on that basis that people become Christians in the first place. So that's really the origins of the idea that conscience is something, and its exercise is something that ought to be protected. It's a very distinctly Judeo-Christian idea at its inception.
As part of that whole business of responding to conscience, it's often pretty hurtful. They can be journeys that are hard to go through. One of the things that worries me is that we're getting a little bit too inclined to say we've got to avoid offending anybody, therefore we've got to clamp down on any speech which might upset people's equilibrium a little bit. I always push back against that by saying, actually, I think as I look back over my life, some of the most beneficial things that have happened, the things that I treasure most, have come about because somebody said something to me that initially was offensive and hurtful. And I'd apply that to my own faith. When I look back on it, suddenly I realised that I was being told that I was not exactly the person I thought I was.
Yes.
Are we in danger of trying to protect ourselves, wrap ourselves in cotton wool to the point where we just turn ourselves into ciphers?
I think there's a significant risk of that over-control of discourse on the basis of concepts like safety and not giving hurt or offence. Clearly, there's always going to be a balance between what is permitted and, what is good speech and what is bad speech. But the way I think about it is this: we should lean in favour of free speech as a society. We should have minimal legal restrictions on speech. There are other sanctions than legal sanctions on poor exercise of free speech. They tend to be social sanctions. I'm not going to you're not coming to my dinner party, or well, I'm not going to meet you at the pub or the cafe because you've taken that view, or I give you a robust rebuttal of whatever you've just said, or we have a robust Facebook or Instagram conversation on something. They are the better ways of dealing with poor speech or speech with which we disagree. To impose legal restrictions on speech on the grounds that someone may be hurt or offended is almost always, I think, an overkill. The state should not be intruding in there. The state should be there to protect, things like defamation, people's rights. It should be stopping the incitement of violence against others through vilification laws, perhaps the incitement of true hatred as well. But to go with this modern trend of saying we are going to deploy the power of the state, legal sanctions, fines, etc., against people because they say something which other people can be hurt or offended by, is far too high a price to pay. And as you said, John, the classic argument for free speech has always, and the risk of offence that carries with it, has always been that we don't know everything. We don't yet have the perfect truth.
Yep. Unless
I am exposed to other ideas and other arguments, preferably in a respectful and rational and reasoned manner, I may never change. Yep. I may never get to a better position than I'm in now. Our society may never get to a better position. So the idea that the state can shut things down is, I think, well, throughout history, to defer to Sarah, has almost always been a retrograde step when we've had sedition laws misused and all manner of restrictions like that. We need to minimise legal restrictions on speech, I think. There are some cases where it's justified, but minimise them certainly on the basis of people being hurt or offended. And if there's hurtful or offensive things, say, turn it off, turn the radio off, don't engage on the Facebook, or alternatively engage with the rebuttal, engage with counter-arguments, have those sort of discussions. And that way truth will come out and we'll all get a more rounded view, because we all live in our own little bubbles. And one of the ways we get out of our bubbles, our social media echo chambers, is to engage with people who have different ideas to us.
Thank you for watching this episode. We appreciate your support. If you value vital conversations like this one, be sure to subscribe to the channel there and also click the notification bell to stay up to date with new releases.